nurture, and deepen the prosperity of our souls together.
Hi, welcome back to Soul Snacks. This week's episode, we have another special guest with us, a very dear friend and brother of mine. And this week we're going to be looking at the topic of grief. Grief is a natural response to loss, right? And every single human being, if you live long enough, at some point in your life or another, or at several points in your life, you will experience grief, whether it's the death of a loved one, the death of a friend, the death of a parent, the death of a child, the death of a friendship, the death of a marriage. You'll experience grief in some form or another. And today we're going to be discussing grief as it relates to the death of a brother. My dear friend Toyin is going to be sharing with us his experience. Thank you so much for joining me today, Toyin.
I was happy to.
Thank you for joining me on Soul Snacks. So, we've had personal conversations, in the past, and I just felt like you've learned so much and gleaned so much from the process you went through from the death of your brother that I feel like it'll be great to share with the audience and discuss so that we can learn one or two things on how to nurture and deepen the prosperity of our souls and how we manage difficult circumstances in life, one of them including grief, one of the most difficult really, especially the impact on our emotions, on our mental, psychological, emotional well-being, even physical well-being as well, right? So Toyin, please tell us about the passing of your brother and just the situation and circumstances that surrounded the whole situation, and particularly also how you got to find out.
Thanks. Before that, I want to drop something so that I make sure that we come back to it, and that is how personal grief is. And so I'd say that because in the context of learning from it, I'm sure there are things that can be picked up, but then the experience is so personal. One event, different people experience it in different ways, and so the experience of grief for each of those people in that same event will be quite different.
Very true.
I remember when my brother passed, and we had people coming to pay their respects and to share in our grief at that time, and to share their own grief as well. And sometimes people would say that, they knew how we felt because they had been through similar situations. And I remember very often thinking to myself that, I feel awful and I don't want anyone else to feel this awful. So knowing how I feel doesn't really, I understand why people are saying it, but it didn't necessarily make me feel better
Didn't make
at
you
the
feel
time.
better.
Because I just felt like nobody should have to feel this way.
Yeah.
And to come to your question, part of that was also because of the circumstances and how I was processing it at the time, or maybe not processing it also. So my brother and I'll start with, we were very, very close. We were best friends. I remember...
Are you older or younger, sir?
He was my older brother.
He was your older
4
brother,
years older
okay.
than I was. I remember another very close friend of ours who he and my brother were very close, around the same age. Me and his brother were very close, around the same age. We had been in the same class and since secondary school, so we'd known each other for decades. Around the time I moved back, I remember him making a comment that I didn't get until my brother passed. So this is like 4 years later. And he was saying that he used to enjoy spending time around my brother and I because we're like best of friends. And I was like, I don't get it. Like, you and your brother are also best of friends. And he was like, no, that like he and his brother are very close, but their relationship is primarily brothers. And the relationship I had with my brother was like primarily friends. And it's later on I got to understand what he was saying and the context of that as well. It's with family, there's proximity, there is shared experiences, there's a kind of easy intimacy that can come with family. Even if you have a difficult relationship, because of all that you go through together. It's relatively, maybe easy is not the word, but easier than with whereas with friends, you choose it, you build it.
True. Yes.
And that creates a different kind of bond, especially when it's a healthy and strong relationship. And so my brother and I had both. And that was again, with retrospect, I thought it had just happened, but then I realized that he had been intentional about it. Just obviously not announcing it to me like, hey, let's come and be, but what happened, so my brother and I had been living together at the time. And he went to Abuja for a friend's wedding. And again, because we had been friends for so long, I knew the friend he had gone to the wedding for. As a matter of fact, I remember the weekend before I had seen the friend. I mean, I was also invited to the wedding. I just chose not to go because at the time I was swamped with work.
Okay. Wow.
And I remember telling him, like, because my brother is similar to me. Like, once you're in your comfort zone, it can be hard to move. And I remember telling him, like, look, I hope you're planning to go for this wedding. Have you bought your tickets? Like, this is your friend from way back. Like, you have to be there. And it was like, of course, And so, there are times when there are people who, especially around the time he passed, people who said, why did he have to travel for the wedding? And I always felt quite strongly that, like, he should have gone. Like, it was a very close friend of his getting married. Like, he should have been there.
No regrets.
No regrets from that perspective, no. So we had been living together. I was working in investment banking at the time. He was working in consulting, so both kind of busy lives. Even though we were living together and close, we didn't often kind of like just hang out, sort of thing. It would very often be as one of us is waking up, the other one is heading out. As one of us is going to sleep, the other one is coming back, like that sort of thing. Very often. And so I remember the Thursday of the week before he passed, or the Thursday of the week before the weekend, I had been exhausted at work. I remember telling my boss that day that I was just flat out and like I would need to take a break, like once we had gotten through the next milestone of what we were working through, and my boss said that was fine. Came home that evening, my brother was out, and I remember, I think sitting down to watch TV to just kind of relax a bit. I was exhausted. And so we lived in an apartment block in 1004. Our flat was almost the last on the hallway. And I say that because usually if you heard somebody walking down the hallway long enough, you knew if they were coming to our place. Because, and so I kind of heard him coming that evening down to the house. And because I was exhausted, I just thought to myself, you know what, I'm just going to switch off everything, go to bed so that, I have my peace and quiet and I can just sleep. And he came in, I had gotten to bed, lights off. I remember him kind of knocking on my door and opening the door and asking.
This was when?
This was June 2012.
So the same month?
This was late May, actually.
Okay, late May.
Or thereabouts.
So a few weeks before?
Days.
Days?
Not weeks.
Oh, wow.
Days before. He passed on June 3rd, 2012. That was a Sunday. This was the Thursday before, so maybe June 1st or something.
Yes, wow.
Or the May 30th probably. And so he opens my door. And he calls my name once or twice and he's like, "Are you sleeping?" And in my mind I'm like, "Dude, I'm in bed, lights are off. Like, why are you disturbing me?"
Wow.
But I was like, "Yeah, I'm sleeping, I'm tired." And then he had been applying for business schools at the time, and so he said that he wanted me to have a look through his application before submitting it early the next morning, and I was like, it's fine, I need to go to work early the next morning as well, so I'd like look through the next morning and give him my feedback. And then he kind of insisted. He was like, that's fine, but it will be basically like for him to kind of work through any feedback I would have to read it that night. Okay. This was around 11 o'clock.
Yeah.
And bear in mind, like part of the reason I gave the detail was I was exhausted. Like already telling my boss that, look, as in, this one is not that I'm tired, I'm exhausted.
Yeah.
And so he was like, okay, that's fine. And then a thought just kind of crossed my mind. I don't remember who it was I had been listening to at the time, but a Bible teacher mentioned something along in the context of sometimes being sensitive to interruptions. And they gave things like the woman with the issue of blood, and I think even Jairus, or there were 2 or 3 examples about how, in the ministry of Jesus, despite, Jesus having a clear mission, there were times when he was faced with seeming interruptions, but they ended up being miracles when he responded. And so that thought just crossed my mind.
Wow.
And
at that point.
Wow. That's one of the primary ways where God speaks to me. It's just that fleeting thoughts that you kind of
you can
sometimes
miss very
learn
easily.
to recognize. You often miss, but sometimes you also learn to recognize that that thought didn't come from me, so let me just pay attention.
Yeah.
And so it was because of that thought that I was like, okay, let me come and read through. So this is like 11 o'clock, and business school essays they're not long, but they kind of draw depth out of you. That's what they're intended to do. And so in the course of and obviously we were close, so I knew his life, I knew his experiences, and so in the course of kind of reading through those essays, we ended up hanging out in a way we hadn't done probably as long as we had been living together, which was about a year. I ended up going to bed like 4 o'clock that morning.
Wow.
Exhausted me. We had talked about difficult things, like when our parents' marriage ended and broke up, and not in a peaceful way. We had talked about living in the UK and different things that we went through together, different challenges we had seen our parents going through. We talked about relationships, work, dreams. We talked about funniest scenes we had seen in movies. I remember him playing one particular scene from a movie that we literally both laughed to tears over. It was just kind of like a great moment. And then I went to bed. In fact, I remember when we got to the top of the staircase, I was probably the more mushy one, so I was like ready to give him a hug, and then he just kind of stuck his hand out for a for a shake. Then we went to bed. The next morning, I rushed out. He was still getting ready, so I don't think I saw him. I think I can vaguely even remember what he was listening to. I could probably remember it if I tried, but I went out to work.
So now this is Friday morning.
This is Friday morning. Came back Friday, tired, went to bed early. He wasn't back. I think I heard him when he came back. Saturday morning, I went to a Bible study that I'd started attending at the beginning of the year that a friend of mine had invited me to. And the funny thing is, I felt a little like, I think my stomach was off that morning. And so even while I was at the Bible study, I kept running back and forth to toilets. And at the end of that session, a couple of my friends had also been there, and they were going to go for brunch, and I had thought in my mind, okay, should I go home and just see my brother before? His name was Wale. So should I go home and see Wale before he leaves, or go have brunch? And I decided to go have brunch. So yeah, I had come back from the fellowship. Now this is the Saturday afternoon. I was still exhausted because Thursday I was up until 4 with Wale. Friday out early, back late, exhausted, slept, up early on Sunday, fellowship, then I had the brunch. Then I came back, and I remember wanting to sleep. I remember having a relatively short debate with myself about, okay, should I sleep or should I pray? And I felt like I hadn't prayed in a while, like taking time to just kind of pray in a while. So I decided to pray. And I remember while I was praying, at some point, most of this I was praying in the Spirit and praying in tongues. And I remember at some point kind of feeling, again, I remembered reading something where maybe I think it was Kenneth Hagin or someone, that at some point when he wanted to pray for his family, it might not have been Kenneth Hagin, but when he wanted to pray for his family, he would like take pictures to kind of focus his attention and, you know, use the pictures in praying for who he was, who he had in mind. And so I started to do that, praying for family. And then I remember when I got to my brother, feeling like I should just kind of tarry a bit. And so I tarried and tarried until I didn't have that feeling anymore. At least I thought I didn't have that feeling anymore. And then after that, I think I went to sleep. I don't remember what I did the rest of the day. So fast forward to Sunday, my brother was meant to come back on Sunday. At the time, I used to host a fellowship for Daystar, the church I was a part of, Sunday evenings. And so the idea was like he needed to be back in time because, actually, to add more context, my dad's birthday is June 4th.
Okay.
And so there was like a little party at the house, not party, but just hosting people at the house on that Sunday the 3rd in advance of his birthday, the following day. And so the idea was I was going to go there after church, and then around the time I would need to head back for fellowship, my brother should have arrived, and so that was the plan. And so I remember speaking to him when he was on his way to the airport. He was running late. I remember speaking to him when he had just gotten his ticket. And it's funny because I haven't said this explicitly, the way he passed was he was on the Dana flights that crashed. He had gotten his ticket.
Coming back from Abuja to Lagos.
Yeah. He had gotten, when he got the Dana ticket, like I remember, I didn't feel any way about it. I had traveled a fair bit for work around that time to Abuja as well, and Dana was at that point my airline of choice as well, because I think they were a relatively new airline, so you kind of assume that they were doing things well, and they had a thing for kind of leaving on time. And so I spoke to him when he was on the plane. I remember him mentioning that he was sitting next to a friend of his that I knew. It was like, okay, I'll see you. In fact, what was it I said? I think I said, have a good trip or something like that.
Wow. So he was on the plane and you spoke to him?
Yeah.
Wow.
And then go back to my dad's house where we're having people over. I remember sitting next to one of my cousins who, after a point, he and my brother were close. So after a while, he kept asking me, have I heard from Wale? Have I heard from Wale? I remember I was like, he's on his way now. Why are you? I didn't realize he had started to hear things about something potentially having happened. At some point, I felt like, okay, I needed to head back because I was hosting fellowship. People were going to be coming over, so he would just, get there. And so I went to, I started to set off. One of my friends, family friends who was there, ironically, sibling to the other friend I mentioned earlier that made the comment here. We were leaving at the same time because she used to come to the fellowship as well. And I think she was the first person to mention that she was hearing that there had been a plane crash. Wow. And two things crossed my mind. I think I must have done a search or something. I must have seen that there was an Arik flight that I think either gone to Ghana or come to Ghana that had landed but had issues landing or something. And so I was just kind of like, no, I think that's it. They're fine. Excuse me. And I also just instinctively remembered, when I'd been praying the previous day and, my brother coming to mind, and I was like, no, they'll be fine, don't worry. And we went back. By the time I got back to start fellowship, it had now been confirmed that there had been a plane crash. Where people were at that point was confirming the manifest. And so it wasn't clear. There was still two stories about which. Yeah, I mean, it was relatively clear it was Dana, but it wasn't. There was still talk about Arik. It wasn't initially clear. And even when it was confirmed there was Dana, there were different versions of a manifest circulating.
Okay.
And so, of course, that fellowship session just became about praying. I mean,
Wow.
whether or not my brother was involved, it was clear that something had
Yeah.
happened. I was already, it's hard to describe how I felt,
Wow.
because when I think back to a lot of that experience, a lot of it feels like an out-of-body experience. It was, I'm trying to think of an analogy to explain it, but if you can imagine maybe the difference between touching something that you know is hot and then like just having something extremely hot put on your body. Like, you know, the way in one scenario you will kind of feel the pain, in another scenario it's just kind of like there's so much shock with the pain that you know, the shock kind of
Wow.
affects the physical or how you
Yeah.
feel in that moment.
Wow.
And it feels, that whole scenario was very much like that. So I remember, you know, we're praying, and I was trying to stay positive, which, as you know, news kept on coming in, was just increasingly difficult.
Wow.
I know at some point when we were praying and worshiping, I broke down,
Wow.
but then I felt like, no, just encourage yourself. There was still, I think there was at that point one version of the manifest that had the name on it, another version of the manifest that didn't. So right after fellowship, first thing I did was go back to my dad's house. He was the one here in Lagos. My sister and my mom were in the UK.
Okay. Okay.
And so I went back to my dad's house, and I think I remember, and I'll come back to this because it's part of what I mentioned about how people process grief differently, but I remember, like, I think it was up until the next day, my dad didn't speak to anyone except me once he got the news. Like, he didn't speak to anyone. And then at some point that evening, I think some folks had reached out to some people at one of the airport authorities to kind of figure out what was going on with this different manifest circulating and what was the official one. The official one had his name on it. And the other thing, if you remember that time, sometimes you would arrive late to get a ticket. They're selling you a ticket that has somebody else's name on it because maybe the person canceled last minute. So there were also those things where it's kind of like, okay, even if somebody's name is there, doesn't mean they're there, like different issues.
Did you ever try calling him?
Oh yeah. I mean, but I knew he was on the.
That's true.
Yeah.
That's true.
But yeah, I mean, around that time, so many times I think I remember I tried to call him. So many times I kind of, so this was one of the things for me. I felt like I for quite a while I refused to accept that he had passed, and I was praying that, you know, I didn't care how God would do a miracle, but that he would just turn up. And it wasn't
quite a while. Like how long? Can you say?
Until his remains were identified.
Wow.
His remains were identified the first week of August, so this was 2 months.
Wow.
I remember, you know, at some point, some of my friends, you know, awesome, wanting to be there for me and praying along with me. I remember having a conversation with a couple of my friends at the time saying that, listen, this is one of the things that I believe God helped me understand at the time. You know, I'm a Christian. The Bible says faith comes by hearing, hearing by the word of God in Romans 10:17. And I felt very much, you know, studying that around the time that faith is usually not initiated by us, by men, faith in God. Even if, again, it's not necessarily explicit. God doesn't show up and say, I'm God, I'm giving you faith for this. You know, it might entirely, you might get fed up of something and decide to take a stand, but I believe faith is initiated by God. And so what it means is that essentially we don't direct God because we have faith. Like it's what God has determined He will do and given us the faith for that He will do.
Yeah, true.
And I was clear about that. So I was clear that I was asking God to do something, not that I was believing God would do something He had said He would.
Yeah.
And I told my friends that because I didn't want anybody to then say, God let us down. Like that wasn't the scenario. You know, you can't, if I didn't commit to do something for you, you can't come and say that I let you down.
Yeah.
But that was, it was, looking back, it's weird because I think in some ways, not soaking the reality when it was so fresh and so harsh as well, because it was so sudden, such a violent way for someone to pass. It was in a lot of ways a national tragedy. It wasn't a private thing.
Yeah.
You know, it felt like so many people
Yeah.
had a relative, a friend, a colleague that passed on that flight as well. For weeks we had people who would come to commiserate. Not days, I mean literally weeks, about 2-3 weeks. It took quite a while before.
So your mom and your sister, did they have to fly back?
Eventually, yes. I mean, yeah, at some point they came down. That was another thing for my mom. I mean, because my mom is one of those people who is, I wouldn't describe as tech savvy. Like she would be like, "Where's the remote? Can you help me change the channel?" sort of person. And so we were hoping that we would get to somebody. In fact, my sister was living in Scotland at the time in Edinburgh. She took a train immediately to come down to London. My uncle that lived in, or my older cousin, my uncle that lived in Croydon, was also going to meet my mom. And the idea was, you know, obviously they didn't want, if people just suddenly show up, you obviously know something is wrong. So trying to find a way to kind of show up and ease her into it. Only to realize that this, my non-tech savvy mom that day had just somehow gone on the internet, gone on Google, or maybe BBC, not Google, and then seen that there was a plane crash. And she obviously knew that my brother had gone for the run. So she found out she was alone.
Wow.
Which is something that I always, I can't imagine what that was like for her to be alone when you find out something like that.
And was she searching because she had heard a plane crashed, or she was just?
I think she was just.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
And so for the first, I don't know how many hours, you know, she dealt with that by herself.
Wow.
I remember the next morning, the morning after the news broke. This is the Monday, my dad's birthday. From like 5:30, there were people at the gates, and I remember thinking to myself, like, you know, why can't people leave? I mean, I'm a social introvert, and so, you know, I can be very social, but I'm an introvert at core. And so I didn't embrace it initially, but there was someone who I remember who actually, a friend of mine, who said to me two things. One, they're grieving as well. You know, he was a cousin to them, a friend to them, you know, a colleague to them.
Yeah.
You're not the only person that loved him, basically.
Yeah.
They're grieving as well, but they're also coming with the hope that they ease your pain and share your grief. And although I initially wasn't receptive to it, I did come to see how valuable it was to have people that just cared about you, cared for you, shared, you know, were willing to share the burden in that moment. And so those were some of the things that it really, till now, I would say, pained me that my mom didn't have that. Even my sister didn't have that. But you can imagine, to the point I made earlier about grief being different, like, I imagine my parents have a very different level of grief than I did, you know. And so, yeah, that was how we found out what had happened. For weeks, I was there trying to balance between, I believe he's going to show up, and I am in the midst of people who have accepted his past. and you balance that without being crazy. Because, you know, at some point I remember I could hear or see some of the whispers like, you know, okay, Toyin is in his own place.
Wow,
like just, you know.
Wow. How did you finally come to accept that he's not coming back? Was there a major event, or you said when they discovered his remains?
Yeah.
Was that when the journey began, or it just clicked immediately that, okay, now I accept it? Or
So
was it
to
a
be honest,
journey still?
I think because I knew I was asking God for something, like I said, it wasn't like God had said or put in my heart that, you know, don't worry, this. You know how like when I mentioned Jairus, Jesus and Jairus earlier, when Jairus came and got the news that his daughter had passed, Jesus immediately spoke to him and, you know, encouraged him not to, you know, I didn't feel like it was that. I felt like I was the one coming and asking. And I guess, I mean, you know, you can argue technically, or maybe I didn't have faith or whatever, was it doubt? Who knows? But it was very clear in my mind that this is a hope I have, but it's not something God has committed to do. And so because of that, staying in that place of holding that expectation, to be honest, became difficult after a while as well. I mean, 2 months is a long time to expect someone that, you know, someone is going to turn up. And so I started to feel, I don't know if I call it the burden at some point to let it go, but that I was contending with that around the same time. And so I did accept when in fact, I still partially accepted. I remember there was still so with the remains, that was a whole different issue. It's hard when you hear something like that happening. You don't, if you're not involved, you don't have a reason to think about how messy it is, and the fact that, you know, there's been intense fire. You know, it didn't dawn on me that remains would be unrecognizable. And so my sister and I, by this point she had come, we used to go every day to Lassuth, I think it was, in GRA, where the team that Lagos State had put in place were there to kind of work through the remains. They're using, I think, what for Nigeria was advanced forensic methods to try and identify. And so it took a while because the plane crashed into buildings. People on the ground had also passed away. And I remember it was I think the day before, 2 days or so, or maybe the day before, we had eventually scheduled for the burial that oh no, okay, so they had found some remains. How to describe, but there was trying to not be too graphic. They had found some remains, but there wasn't a body intact. And so the remains they had initially found were you know, I guess, not much is one way to describe it in terms of the physical mass. And then the day before the burial, because once they found remains, we then scheduled for the burial and everything. And so the evening before the burial, they found a more significant portion of remains. And so I went with my sister there, and I remember, it will sound silly now, but I remember taking a handkerchief with me, still trying to like hold on to that thing. And that's when I hadn't realized that, I hadn't pictured what it would be when I thought remains at that point. I thought I would see a body I recognized, but lifeless. And what I saw was anything but that. You know, it was part of a torso. The shock of that. I remember having the handkerchief and just like, you know, the shock of that was intense. It was very intense. And one of the things that was sort of really left an indelible mark on me was understanding how much a human being is not a body. Because because there he was. There he was and there he wasn't. But that was the point where, I fully accepted that, okay, this is what has happened. Still, even now, from time to time, think I see somebody that looks like him, and there's part of me that, like, again, I'm like, I don't care what sense it does or doesn't make. Maybe, he fell out, lost his memory, but there he is, but yeah.
Wow. Thank you for sharing all of that. That has blessed me, and I'm sure it's blessed so many other people. Thank you so much for sharing that. Thank you. I really appreciate it. It has blessed me. I mean, there's so many details to that kind of tragic loss that you had to deal with, your family and all the other families involved as well, that we people on the outside may not even be privy to, because it's, I mean, the remains, going to see the remains, like, I can't even imagine. Whew, does the memory stay, like, do you constantly have flashbacks? Did you struggle? What were some of the coping mechanisms you used? Did that cause trauma for you? Because it wasn't just now hearing that your brother has passed on. You had to wait till they were able to locate any remains. Then they located remains, they called you to come and view the remains. Then you see something that is totally not what you're expecting. I mean, something really graphic. And then you have to start planning the burial, and so sudden. Yeah, like, so two questions here. Did this have any impact on you in terms of being a real trauma that you maybe constantly started having flashbacks, maybe nightmares, I don't know, anything that you'd like to share? And also, what were your strategies or coping mechanisms through that process, and how did you go through that process?
So in terms of strategies and coping mechanisms, strategies is probably
not the right word. Yeah. Sorry.
You're thrown into the
Obviously,
deep end.
you can't strategize.
No, but
no.
I understand what you're asking.
Yeah.
A lot of times I wonder if I became born again just to survive that moment in life for me. Because of how close my brother and I were, he was a pillar in my life.
Wow.
He was. If you had asked me who I looked up to, it was him.
Wow.
So, I think I'm still discovering how it has affected me. I've heard friends and colleagues kind of talk about some of the changes in how in how I interact with people who knew me before, people who knew me after. And so, in all honesty, I'm probably not the best person to ask how it affected me. How I coped with it at the time, well, now it's fair to say I was in denial. Actually, maybe not fair to say, because again, like I said, I acknowledge that it wasn't as if I'm saying he's not dead, God has told me. It wasn't like that.
Yeah.
It was just I had this desire, and I wasn't willing to contemplate, the desire not coming through. But I was aware that it was a desire. Nobody was committed to kind of fulfilling it. But there were a couple of things. So the first thing like I said, I say weeks. I think it was longer than weeks in truth, where every day the house was full with people coming to commiserate with us. And the truth is, their love was powerful.
Wow.
That's the only thing I can say. I remember one friend of mine in particular who was also a colleague, who he was much like me in the sense, when something like that happens, my natural self, I might not just come, I might ask you if you want me to come. And he kept asking me like multiple times every day, should they come? And I kept saying, no, we're good. He eventually came with some of my colleagues. And later on, I remember feeling quite bad that I hadn't just allowed him to come. I guess, understandably, maybe I didn't understand how my grief was affecting me. Like, it's hard. for me anyway, it was hard to be aware of how it was affecting me. And then with this dichotomy, or not even dichotomy of me trying to kind of keep this space where I'm not accepting that's the reality, was also something.
Yeah.
But I think the first thing I would say is God just had so many people constantly coming. I mean, it was clear. I don't know how some people worked in that period, because they were there. So did they take time off because we were grieving? Like, it seemed like it must have been like that, because there were people who were there every day.
Every day.
For weeks, not for a couple of days.
Wow.
Not for,
Wow.
There were people who I knew.
Are these like his friends or your friends?
Everyone's.
Wow.
My dad's friends.
Amazing.
My mom's friends. My sister's friends.
That is amazing.
My friends. My brother's friends. My brother was he was also a social introvert, but he was a real people person. And so, like, his friends till today are like my older brothers. I mean, they were even then. So it's not even like, okay, they had always been that sort of thing, and even more so. And I remember them, some of my cousins, the kind of support, and especially like a lot of my older cousins, some of I mean, we were carried. That's probably the way to put it. Like, we were carried on quite a few shoulders, not just one or two, through that period. And that was, I can never estimate just how much that made a difference, but I know it did. And so I would say, in terms of the things that helped, that was number 1, 2, and 3. Just having people around that cared. They were just there to love you.
That's awesome.
They weren't putting their grief on you, because they were also grieving. That's why they knew it was important to be there.
Yeah.
It was absolutely incredible. I had friends who weren't in the country but would check on me constantly, send me messages, be praying for me. Knowing that you're truly loved is really powerful. And in some moments, I don't know how to describe it, and I can't think of anything to relate. It's like being in a dangerous situation, but having a reason to believe you are safe in that situation.
Wow. Amazing.
And that's kind of what that meant for me.
Amazing. So there was a healing that was coming through from all the love that you got for weeks on end.
Yeah. Healing, strength, comfort. And it wasn't just, look, my colleagues, when I look back, I realized that, for probably the better part of a year, if not
wow,
my colleagues were just helping to nurture me back, never explicitly. The other thing about coping that I think really helped me a lot was just sinking into my relationship with God. And so I remember the days were too busy to pray. In the evenings, after everyone had gone to sleep, I would take time to just kind of pray, meditate, read the Bible, stuff like that. I often felt like I was getting maybe a devotional message that really spoke to where I was at that point in time. And that really, really helped me. It's weird because I should have been exhausted, and I was, but that probably gave me more strength than sleeping would have given me.
Amazing.
And so that was really, those are two things that I can say, having just this amazing support. It's just so much kindness and selflessness and generosity from so many people at that time. And just also just settling into my faith and my relationship with God. I think that's what got me through. And actually, I'll just quickly add something which, I guess depending on where different people are, it might mean something to some, it might not mean something to some. One of the concerns I had was, what's happened to my brother's spirit, because I'm Christian. I believe that, judgment comes at some point, and I wasn't sure, I wasn't assuming, and it was something that I was asking God about. And then I remember just having this moment during, it was the funeral service, not the service of songs, that just, I felt like in a way that I won't go into describing, but I just felt like God had shown me that He had taken my brother. And in fact, I saw what it was, just a glimpse, a man in white walking through the aisle of a plane and touching people.
Wow.
And I remember speaking to someone, a couple of people afterwards, just kind of asking what that meant, not wanting to presume, but like, you know, the general sort of consensus was, you've been praying about this and God is showing you that, you know, He's taking your brother. And I remember being particularly concerned that I didn't see Him touching my brother in particular. Somebody was like, come, God is not that wicked. that He has shown you what He has shown you for a reason. And that gave me a lot of comfort as well, because ultimately there's more pain in knowing that, you know, someone has not gone to a better place, which I believe is a reality. But yeah, just that also, I think, gave me a lasting sort of peace. And with that, I remember, again, my faith is a big part of how I deal with things in life. There's a story in the Bible that Jesus talks about a poor man, Lazarus, that dies, and the rich man that then dies. The rich man is in torment. Lazarus is, you know, in peace. And the rich man wants Lazarus to go and tell his brothers to, you know, take God seriously, more or less.
Yeah, pretty much.
What I took from that, because a lot of people would say to me, coming from a good place, like, you know, now you have to carry on his memory and so on, which I didn't have a problem with. But when that sort of scripture, what I took from that was that, you know, when we pass on, like, it's no more about what this person wanted to do, what that person, even the deceased, are now like, this is what you should have done, what God wanted you to do. And so for some people, they might have lost someone and they might feel the burden of carrying on that person's memory. And I'm not saying it's wrong or they shouldn't, but especially if you already have a relationship with God and you believe in Christ, I would say that you should, whatever Christ wants you to do is what you need to do, and you're not betraying the person or letting down their memory or their honor, because you're not maybe carrying on something they were doing.
Wow, amazing. Thank you so much for all that you've shared, Toyin. And on last words, I just wanted to ask if there was someone out there, let's imagine that there's someone going through grief, has lost somebody close to them. What are your last words? What are your last words of comfort to that kind of person going through grief right now?
Last words. I'm not a mental health professional, and like I said, grief is very personal, but I would say that in my experience and experience of other people I know who have grieved different things, I would say grief is very, very painful by nature. However, I think the process of grieving is necessary and healthy. Because it's painful, there might be a tendency to kind of back away. But I would encourage the person as much as possible to find the one or two people of love, trust, and support that they have around them, even if it's professionals, even if it's not friends, and allow your process to happen so that you can heal and, you know, live on. It can be easy to kind of put the grief somewhere without processing it, without healing, and then it becomes more of a burden as you move on. So that's one thing I would say. The other thing is not so much about what you do when you're grieving, but just in life, you don't know when your last moment is. You don't know when the last moment you have with other people are. And so embrace as much of those moments as you can. The memory I have of that Thursday night I spent with my brother before, you know, I don't know where I would be without that memory. And at the time, I didn't know what that was going to mean to me. And so,
So remembering that was the last time you guys spent so much time together, you don't regret that decision to go and help him read through his MBA application.
I am immensely grateful that, you know, I had that prompt to make that decision. If not, I think I would deal with a lot of regret that I'd never had to deal with, and I don't know what that would have been like.
Yeah. Beautiful. Thank you so much, Toyin, for joining me on Soul Snacks. It was beautiful listening to you. Really appreciate it. This is my friend, Oluwatoyin Olubake. So thank you for being with us on Soul Snacks.
Thanks for having me, Bookie.
Wholesome snacks for the soul. Now you know that was share-worthy. So why don't you share, like, comment, and subscribe to Oasis with BDO for more episodes of Soul Snacks.